Yo, what is up everyone? Back here with another video. Today we're going to be doing a video on how to build restricted pairs. So that sounds a little vague, and I'm kind of going to go through a couple of different builds of each restricted pair so you guys can understand how it's constructed, how it's used, and just to give you guys a little bit more context if maybe you're looking to even build on these teams yourself. So we're going to be using a couple different resources here, right? Primarily going to be talking about some recent tournaments that were held. You know, obviously, a lot of the recent results from a team tournament that's being held. So just a bunch of stuff there, right? So to go through it, right, pretty much the main thing that I would like to touch on first would be a couple of the different archetypes that I think are really successful right now and what I would consider more so worth going into, right? So the main archetypes that I find really valuable to like look into right now are Evoltalization, right? Evoltalization's 1. Palkia and Zacian, right? Then you have Kyogrezian, right? Kyogrezian. And then finally, for the last one that I think is super solid or like relevant, right, would be Groudonization, right? Now, all these archetypes are solid in their own regards and do their own things that are pretty, you know, useful to teams overall. So what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about the most popular builds for each of them and kind of going through which ones I think are a little bit better, which ones are a little bit worse. So first off, right, I want to talk about the Groudonization build. So typically these archetypes are based around supporting the Groudonization. The one weakness that they share is that they're pretty weak to Intimidate usually. So usually the way you compensate for that is by having a pretty strong special attacker. So that's why typically when you're building out around this core, you usually want something like Charizard. Other potential options you could have as a special attacker, something like Zapdos maybe, or running Thundurus, physical Thundurus on the team to pretty much discourage Intimidate. Could be a couple of different ways you can approach it, right? So that would be a couple ways I would think you can kind of approach it from here. And then typically the way you'll see it built out is kind of to support the bulk on these teams, right? So for example, right, the most popular version of the team right now with Grimmsnarl, Incineroar, Gastrodon, right, is pretty much meant to highlight the bulk of the team. And you'll actually kind of see the team is actually popping up a lot within both NPA and, you know, Victory Road. If you guys don't know what NPA is, basically a team league. VGC does it like every year. It's like, it has a lot of relevant teams to look at. But if you notice here, like you'll kind of see like that Gastrodon, Incin, Groudon, Zacian core kind of pop up consistently, right? Pops up there. Over here, the one that I just showed you. Again, right? And you can kind of see the trend there. So just kind of some cool options there that are worth noting, right? And then you'll even notice the variation of it is literally just the differences is that's running Defiant Thundurus, right? But for the most part, generally the same concept, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the main idea there. And pretty much this team is just around like designed around spreading yawns, right? You can pretty much focus around, you know, kind of covering the weaknesses of Groudon, being able to like swap into Kyogre when Groudon's caught out of position in weather, right? And then also two, you can cover your Charizard from like max geysers. You know, you have coverage moves for lightning with like, or like coverage swaps, or like you can cover your swaps, like basically by swapping a Groudon Gastrodon for Charizard. A lot of different things you can do here, right? That kind of gives the team a lot of flexibility overall. So you'll notice that the build is basically centralized around supporting the capabilities of these three Pokemon, either maxing your Groudon or Charizard. Typically, most teams around this archetype will do that, maybe with some other maxer in the Charizard slot. So that's pretty much what you'd keep an eye out for with this team. But yeah, so anyways, going into, what's it called? Going into the next archetype I want to talk about is Kyogrezian. Now, there are a couple different approaches you can go into it. The version that I use has a different approach than the most common Kyogre teams, right? So we'll touch on the Kyogre teams and have a more standard kind of build that we've seen a lot with Kyogre in the past. So pretty much like a lot of the archetypes including it are so focused around like that quick Tornadus Tailwind, right? Getting the Tailwind up and then being able to deal a lot of damage. So we saw that on the Zacian Ogre team here. Saw it over here as well. And then as we go down, there's one other version of this right here, right? So pretty much what you can notice is, right, is that for the most part, you'll usually see like these really cool you know, ways to implement, I guess, the speed control on these teams. So in like the screens teams, you know, you have like Thunder Wave and you use Airstream for Max Zapdos. On the other teams, you're typically using Tornadus for immediate speed control. So that means that there's really two ways to build out these teams. Typically, it's a Tornadus build with either utilizing like no Intimidate and double Grass, which we kind of saw with Torvive's version, right? So like Kyogrezian, Tornadus, Kartana, Raichu, Mungus. Or you can go with another build, which is pretty much like the same thing with Tornadus, but Agati's build was more so leaned into like Incineroar and Landorus is another mode, right? Which gives you another offensive Dynamaxer. Which gives you another offensive Dynamaxer with like these two, right? And then that kind of goes next to your Zacian. So kind of interesting, a bunch of different modes you can kind of utilize with the team and take advantage of. So kind of a cool approach. And then the final approach to talk about is the screens version. Now, there are a couple different versions of this team that kind of run around, right? So the first version that you usually see is like the double Intimidate version, right? With Landorus, Grimmsnarl. Then you have Incineroar. And then you have, what's it called? What's the last slot? I'm forgetting. Oh, Rillaboom. There you go. Rillaboom, right? So you kind of have a bunch of different options there. This is one of those versions that's been popping up a lot. It's very popular. Then you have my version that uses Zapdos over Landorus, right? So a couple different options there that you can utilize, right? But typically you'll notice that the common trend with these Kyogre teams is having a Max Airstream on next to Zacian and Kyogre. So pretty much you can spam Max Airstream into the grass types that Kyogre doesn't like, or just kind of get speed control next to Zacian and leverage that, you know? So just some good options there. But yeah, overall, I mean, pretty solid choices overall, I feel like. And then you have screens and Intimidate to like mitigate with like bulk, you know, Intimidate, stuff like that. So it's a super nice option. I mean, there are a lot of different approaches you can go with. I mean, there's even a more outdated version using Zapdos that had like Ferrothorn Whimsicott, I think it was. And like you could even add like Rillaboom or something over it, right? So like a couple of different options there, right? Like the more offensive versions of the teams. You have a lot of different ways you can approach stuff. And, you know, you usually go the Tailwind route or you go with the more bulkier kind of defensive route. And that's just more so like a choice for the player to make, I'd say. But yeah, and then finally our next archetype that I wanted to talk about, right? Let me go here. You usually, like with this next archetype, you usually kind of have a semi-linear build, right? So like Palkia is pretty like straightforward. Palkia is basically like you always support the Palkia Max for the most part. Sometimes you have an alternative maxer with Thundurus. So like for example, the team that won early on was pretty much centered around like multiple supports and then like 2 Dynamaxes max, right? So like here, right, on this team, pretty much you'd either be maxing Palkia or you'd be maxing Thundurus. Then the archetype kind of developed and then it kind of tweaked around so that you would run a Ditto here, right? Now you could even run something like a Rillaboom in this slot to pressure stuff like Seismitoad more. But yeah, you could put on a lot of pressure in that regard, but pretty much like you'll notice it's pretty centered around Palkia maxing. That's normally what these teams do. And then in any other case, it's usually like one other Pokemon maxing on the team. So that's kind of the main thing there. But that's just pretty much how you would approach it overall, right? And like that would be the main thought. Overall, I'd say it's a pretty straightforward archetype, so there's not like too much more to discuss about it. But like, yeah, that's definitely like how they're normally constructed. So far we've covered Calyrex, we've covered Groudonization, and we covered Kyogrezian. Next up that I wanted to cover was actually going to be Zacian Yveltal. So this is also another archetype that's being picked up a lot more now, mostly because it can pressure the Common Sun team very well. So currently right now, Zacian Yveltal is really being run with either 2 different compositions, right? The first composition is usually next to screens. So typically you'll notice like it's screens, Landorus, Grimmsnarl, and this core is like pretty prevalent on a lot of teams, mostly because you get Thunder Wave, you get screens to reduce damage. Some like to run Iron Ball. I'm personally more so against that. And then, you know, you kind of leverage your offensive Landorus, right? And then you have the last 2 slots, which are typically something like Gastrodon and Regieleki, right? And like these can put on a bunch of pressure. Sometimes you have a different electric type. Rotom Heat there, for example, is what I use. You have a lot of different options you can go with, basically. All these options have their own like use in a way, right? And like different ways you can utilize them, but for the most part, like you'll notice that they all kind of have the same concept. Then there's pretty much the new versions of the team that's popping around, which is double Intimidate. So pretty much it's going to be Zacian, Yveltal, Regieleki, Landorus, Incineroar, Amoonguss, right? And that's like kind of the new version running around. We kind of saw this team get a lot of play this specific week in NPA, which was worth noting, right? So like even for my team, like 1, 2, 3, 4 use that specific version of the team, then I use the first version that I discussed, right? So like you'll kind of notice that the team is still picking up on usage, and even like one of the teams that we played versus was literally just using another electric type in that slot, right? So kind of interesting there. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it for Evoltalization. Those are the two major builds with it right now. I would expect to maybe see some variation at some point, but that's like the main one that's running around. Finally, I wanted to do like an honorable mention, I guess, for Calyrex Shadowzation. The main reason why I'm not like going to spend too long talking about how this archetype's really built is because it only really has one consistent build right now, which is pretty much support Thundurus, offensive Charizard, right? You have Incineroar, and then you have Gastrodon. It's basically centered around like using the Incineroar and Gastrodon really well to reduce damage. Then you have Charizard to immediately exert pressure. You have Thundurus to kind of work with that prankster against like a lot of different teams. Then you have Groudon and Calyrex. Calyrex offering you the fast Will-O-Wisp to kind of shut down other teams. And then Groudon obviously letting you kind of reduce damage from stuff like, you know, Water Spout. You know, you take hits better, boost up your Charizard. So just a bunch of cool options there that you can take advantage of that just kind of work for the team overall. But I would say since there's only one build for it, it's pretty linear for the most part, right? So you're not really going to be like seeing too many variations of it. But this is a really smart way to build out the archetype. The main variations I could see would be in the Charizard and the Thundurus slot into different slots, but that's kind of like up to, I guess, your preference, you know. But yeah, that's pretty much the main thing there. Then finally, the last archetype I wanted to like bring up, less so rather than like talk too much about. So Calyrex Shadow and Zacian seems like it could still have some better builds lying around. I'm not too sure about it right now, but you'll see that most just biased towards like the Thundurus version with like Rillaboom, Incineroar, Gastro, or you'll see the offensive one with Whimsicott, like eject button. Both of them are okay. I definitely feel like there's some better version that hasn't been used that has some potential, so I definitely keep an eye out for that and maybe see like what's coming up in terms of like this archetype. But this version did just win a major tournament, and it has won another tournament before, and then we've seen like, you know, variations with like Whimsicott do super well as well, you know. So just stuff like that is super cool and stuff to really take advantage of, you know, on the archetype, and definitely some ideas of like how you could build it up. But yep, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I just wanted to kind of give you guys a main idea of how you could kind of explore archetypes in the series, especially since we're getting closer to regionals, and it might be helpful to actually look at different ways you can kind of build these teams out. Now, obviously I didn't go into specific sets. If you guys are looking for resources where you can find specific sets on some of these archetypes, you can check out Victory Road, VGC.com. I'll maybe link this down below. If I'm able to, and you can pretty much check out a lot of the teams. All their open sheets are there, so it can kind of give you an idea of how people are building the teams. You can also even look at NPA just for like the 6 if you're like interested in that, right? And then also too, you have like some other resources that you can check out. Limitless as well is a great one that I've mentioned in other videos. So if you check out some other videos, you'll definitely get a link to that. But yeah. No, definitely for sure, I would check out those resources, kind of see how people are building now. But once again, guys, thank you so much for all the support, as always. Make sure to check out Patreon if you guys would like to support me beyond the videos. And make sure to check out coaching if you guys would like to support me and, work on your skills one-on-one. I've been doing a lot of coaching lately, and it's been super good. So I'm really excited to work with new people. So definitely make sure to check it out if you're interested. But yeah, guys, thank you so much. As always, incredibly appreciate it. And see you guys on the next video.